The mere exposure effect is a psychological phenomenon that profoundly influences our preferences and behaviors, often without us even realizing it. This concept is especially relevant because it reveals how our brains can be swayed by mere familiarity, shaping our daily choices from the music we listen to the people we befriend. As we delve into the fascinating world of the mere exposure effect, get ready to uncover the hidden forces that dictate why you love what you love. As we explore the mere exposure effect further, it's essential to understand that this phenomenon is rooted in our brain's tendency to favor familiarity over novelty. One of the key psychological theories that explain this effect is the mere exposure theory, proposed by psychologist Robert Zajonc in the 1960s. According to Zajonc, repeated exposure to a stimulus, even if we're not consciously paying attention to it, can increase our liking for that stimulus. A notable example of the mere exposure effect in action is the way we form preferences for music. Think about it: when you first hear a new song, you might not immediately love it. But after hearing it several times on the radio or in a playlist, you start to enjoy it more. This isn't just because the song has grown on you, it's also because your brain has become more familiar with the melody, rhythm, and lyrics. My colleagues in the field have found that this effect can be observed even when people are exposed to music without their conscious awareness. For instance, when background music is playing in a store or restaurant. The mere exposure effect has significant implications for our daily lives, particularly in the realm of social relationships. This can be attributed to the fact that repeated exposure to someone's face, voice, and personality makes us feel more comfortable and at ease around them. In my experience with clients, I've seen how this effect can play out in workplace dynamics, where colleagues who sit near each other or work on projects together tend to develop stronger bonds over time. In terms of therapeutic applications, understanding the mere exposure effect can be beneficial for treating conditions like social anxiety disorder. By gradually exposing individuals to social situations or environments that make them feel anxious, therapists can help them become more comfortable and confident in those settings. This approach is based on the principle that repeated exposure can increase familiarity and reduce feelings of unease or discomfort. However, it's also important to acknowledge some of the controversies surrounding the mere exposure effect. Some researchers have argued that this phenomenon can lead to a form of familiarity bias, where we prefer things simply because they're familiar rather than because they're objectively good or valuable. Research has shown that repeated exposure to an idea, even if it's initially met with skepticism, can increase our likelihood of accepting it as true. This is often referred to as the truth effect. My colleagues in the field have found that this effect can be quite pronounced, especially when the information is presented in a way that's easy to understand and remember. One notable study on the mere exposure effect was conducted by psychologist Daniel Kahneman, who demonstrated how repeated exposure to a stimulus can affect our perceptions of its value. In his experiment, participants were shown a series of words, some of which were presented multiple times, while others appeared only once. Afterwards, the participants were asked to rate the likability of each word. The results showed that the words that had been presented more frequently were rated as more likable, even if they had no inherent positive or negative connotations. This finding has significant implications for our understanding of how we form opinions and make decisions. It suggests that our brains are wired to respond positively to familiarity, even if it's not necessarily based on any rational evaluation of the information. In terms of therapeutic applications, the mere exposure effect has been used to help individuals overcome phobias or anxiety disorders. By gradually exposing them to the feared object or situation, therapists can help them become more comfortable and confident over time. However, some researchers have argued that the mere exposure effect can also have negative consequences, such as reinforcing existing biases or prejudices. If we're repeatedly exposed to information that confirms our pre-existing views, we may become more entrenched in our beliefs, even if they're not supported by evidence. This raises important questions about the role of the mere exposure effect in shaping our cultural and social attitudes. To illustrate this point, consider the way that propaganda or misinformation can spread through repeated exposure. If we're repeatedly exposed to a particular message or idea, we may become more likely to accept it as true, even if it's not supported by evidence. This highlights the importance of critical thinking and media literacy in evaluating the information we are presented with. In everyday life, the mere exposure effect can be seen in the way we form preferences for certain foods, music, or activities. We may find that we enjoy something more after repeated exposure, simply because it becomes more familiar and comfortable. This can be a powerful influence on our behavior and decision-making, often operating outside of our conscious awareness. One fascinating aspect of this phenomenon is its relationship to the concept of fluency. Research has shown that when we're repeatedly exposed to a stimulus, it becomes easier for us to process and understand, which in turn can lead to increased liking and preference. This is often referred to as the fluency effect. The familiar song may seem more enjoyable or catchy, not necessarily because it's objectively better, but because your brain has become more efficient at processing its melody and rhythms. This fluency effect can be observed in various domains, from music and art to language and even social interactions. The work of psychologist Robert Zahonk is particularly relevant here, as he demonstrated how repeated exposure can increase our liking for stimuli, even if we are not consciously aware of the exposure. His experiments showed that participants who were subliminally exposed to certain words or images later exhibited a preference for those stimuli, even if they had no memory of the initial exposure. This highlights the implicit nature of the mere exposure effect and how it can operate beneath our conscious radar. Another significant area of research explores the neural mechanisms underlying the mere exposure effect. Studies using functional magnetic resonance imaging (fMRI) have found that repeated exposure to a stimulus can lead to changes in brain activity, particularly in regions involved in emotional processing, such as the amygdala and the nucleus accumbens. These findings suggest that our brains are wired to respond positively to familiarity, which can have important implications for our understanding of decision-making and behavior. In everyday life, the mere exposure effect can be observed in the way we form attachments to certain brands or products. For example, you might find yourself preferring a particular type of coffee or clothing brand, not necessarily because they are objectively superior, but because you have been repeatedly exposed to their advertising or have developed a sense of familiarity with their products. The therapeutic applications of the mere exposure effect are also worth exploring. In the context of exposure therapy, for instance, repeated exposure to a feared stimulus can help individuals overcome anxiety disorders or phobias. By gradually increasing exposure to the feared object or situation, therapists can help patients become more comfortable and confident, reducing their avoidance behaviors and improving their overall well-being. However, it's also important to consider the potential limitations and criticisms of the mere exposure effect. Some researchers have argued that this phenomenon can lead to a form of cultural homogenization, where we prefer things simply because they're familiar, rather than seeking out new experiences or diverse perspectives. This raises important questions about the role of the mere exposure effect in shaping our cultural and social attitudes, and how we might balance the comfort of familiarity with the need for novelty and exploration. In conclusion, the mere exposure effect is a profound psychological phenomenon that reveals how our brains are wired to prefer familiarity over novelty, often operating beneath our conscious awareness. The key takeaways are clear: repeated exposure can increase liking and preference fluency, plays a significant role in this process, and our brains are wired to respond positively to familiarity. As we navigate our increasingly complex world, understanding the mere exposure effect is crucial for making informed decisions, cultivating empathy, and seeking out diverse perspectives. So, the next time you find yourself drawn to something familiar, remember that your brain may be playing a subtle trick on you. Ask yourself, am I truly enjoying this, or is it just the comfort of familiarity? That's all for today's Psych with Sigmund. Remember to like, share, and subscribe, and until next time, may your ego find balance between pleasure and reality.